Day of the 9th Z Jaipur Literature Festival at Charbagh. Before we begin with our first session, we would like to have the book launch. We are delighted to have the book launch of a book named Punji 21वीं सदी में, which is a translation of Capital in the 21st Century. It has been translated by Professor B.S. Bagla and edited by Dr. S.S. Awasthi and published by Dr. Ashok Gupta of Unicorn Books, Delhi. I would like to invite all three of them onto stage for unveiling the book. Thank you so much. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin with our first session, which has been titled Capital. We are delighted to introduce Thomas Piketty with Sebastian Mallaby and Arvind Subramanian. The session will be moderated by Pratap, Bhanu, Mehta. The session is sponsored by AU Financiers.
So this is an extraordinary moment. There's rarely a moment in a discipline where you feel like you're in the midst of a Copernican revolution. And Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, and its Hindi translation has just come out, really is one of those Copernican moments. It has transformed the field, and it has transformed our understanding of human prospects in very deep and profound ways. And today what we hope to do is just capture really a little slice of, in a sense, that revolution. As most of you are aware, it's an extraordinarily rich and big book centered around sort of 4 different kinds of achievements. There's a theoretical argument in the book about the fact that when the rate of return of capital exceeds the rate of growth of income and output, it produces greater inequality. It gives the most robust and long-range empirical account of the evolution of inequality under capitalism, and that itself is such an extraordinary and stunning achievement. It has an incredibly textured historical story about how we came under the illusion that inequality under capitalism would actually correct itself. And it also, to top it all, has one of the best discussions of the institutional framework and mechanisms by which inequality is produced and reproduced in different contexts. Every page is brimming in hypothesis, and we could spend hours discussing it, but we have, in a sense, only an hour. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, just invite Thomas to just explain briefly, how you see the long-term relationship between capitalism and inequality. And particularly perhaps also reflect on this very striking claim you make that the slowdown in growth might actually produce greater inequality because of the relationship that you posit, and how do you see the growth prospects from now on?
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here. And let me first say, how happy and proud I am to have now the Hindi version of my book. I think we live in a world where sometimes, some people imagine that English has become the only language, but I think, it's important to...
That's coming from a Frenchman, by the way.
It's important to remember, not only from my accent, but from, looking at the world, that, there are many languages in the world and all of them are important. It's, what makes me really happy about the success of my book is that it's actually very balanced across the world language. So we have now more than 2 million copies, 2.2 million copies have been sold in the world, and the English language is only 1/4 of this total, between 600,000, which is a lot, but this also means that 3/4 of the world is reading language other than English. Chinese, Japanese, Brazilian, French, Spanish, German, all of these languages together make 1.5 million copies, so which is 3 times more than English. So that's you know, I think this shows that in very different parts of the world with very different history, always complicated and passionate history with inequality, there is a very strong demand for some form of democratization of economic knowledge. And many people, I think what the success of this book shows is that many people are tired to hear that this is too complicated for them, and are tired to hear that economic and financial issues should be left to a small group of experts which have built such sophisticated science that nobody else can understand. And of course, this is a big joke. I mean, these issues of inequality are not technical issues. It's are issues which every citizen wants to make his or her own opinion about. And you know, I think I believe in the power of books and ideas. I think the democratization of knowledge can contribute to the democratization of the economy itself. And indeed, probably the most important historical lesson from this historical study on inequality is that in the 20th century, it took major shocks in developed countries for inequality to correct itself. You know, it didn't come naturally. And in particular, I think one of very important lessons for a country like India is that it took major and very violent shocks, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, the Bolshevik Revolution, the communist counter-model in the Soviet Union, for the elites, for the Western elites to finally accept social and fiscal reforms which they refused until World War I and until these shocks, and which finally were implemented after World War II, and some form of welfare capitalism with some relatively high level of taxation and social spending was put in place after World War II. And this came together with the rise of modern growth and more inclusive and sustainable growth. I think this is a very important lesson to remember for all countries. You know, in Europe, in North America, it took these very violent shocks for these reforms to happen, and I hope that the Indian elites, you know, will be smarter in a way, and will you know, to a large extent, these reforms and the rise of the modern social state and fiscal state has not yet happened in India. I think it's, you know, it's very difficult to have a proper education, health system, infrastructure when the tax to GDP ratio is 10 or 11%. You know, you can do all the efforts you want to make the system more efficient. If the total public budget to the health system in India is 1% of GDP versus 3% in China, you know, there's no way you can do the same with 3 times less money. So I think the Indian elites have to accept at some point that they have to pay more tax to finance for a more inclusive and sustainable development model that we have. So in the West, it took very violent shocks. You know, in my country, in France, the income tax was finally accepted by the elite in the summer of 1914. This was not to pay for schools or hospitals, it was to pay to go to war with Germany. And finally, after 1945, in the 50s, you know, these institutions were used in a more positive and constructive way to invest in sustainable development. And you know, I hope, you know, India, with all its potential, all its energy, will draw from this lesson, invent its own ways for the future, and take the opportunity of high growth to build up a stronger state capability and social capability in the next 10 years.
Sebastian, you know, how do you read this book? I mean, you know, as somebody who's actually sort of worked on kind of finance and capitalism, particularly the central relationship that is posited in this book between capitalism and inequality, that long-term relationship.
Well, I mean, first of all, just to underscore what you probably already know, this is really a fantastic book, which is a sort of a big moment in the history of our debates about economics. And I think it's worth saying at a festival like this that one of the nice things about it is that Thomas brings in references to literature. You know, so Jane Austen's take on inequality, or Balzac's insights about the distribution of wealth in the 19th century, this is part of the sort of rich fabric of his descriptions. And so that's what makes it a great pleasure to read, in addition to this very provocative thesis that there is something kind of ineluctable about the growth of inequality, that we're not, you know, but I think before this book came along, people had a lot of discrete reasons for why inequality was going up. So these ranged from the decline of labor unions in developed countries, the erosion of the minimum wage. Maybe it was about technology supplanting workers. Maybe it was about globalization, so competition with lower wage workers in the developing world. So there were a bunch of discrete theories put forward to try to explain rising inequality. And what this book does, which is different, is to posit a kind of a historian's law. So rather like Arnold Toynbee or Karl Marx or others who looked at history and saw big trends and derived sort of rules, laws, I think that's what Thomas is trying to do. Now, one thing I'd be interested in your comment on is this actually, I mean, how deterministic do you feel? Is this a law or is this just a warning? Because if the central idea is that we're going to face in an environment of slowing growth in the developed world particularly, growth will slow. That's not controversial because demography almost makes that inevitable. Will it be the case that capital grows faster than income? Growth is going to level off, and so will capital just continue on the same trajectory? Myself, I think it's provocative. I'm not persuaded. I'm not persuaded because I think that the amount of return on capital that you have in the last 30 years in some sense reflected a high growth period. And so if you extrapolate into the future, the return on capital may come down just as growth slows. So I'm not totally persuaded, but that's an interesting debate to have. Is this just a law?
Thomas, warning or law? Do you want to come in on this
No,
question?
this is definitely a warning. Look, there is nothing deterministic, there is nothing natural in economic evolutions. You know, economic evolutions always depend on man-made institutions, depend on the legal system, the power struggle, the fiscal system, the social system. So there's nothing deterministic. And you know, certainly as growth slows down and we accumulate more piles of capital, you know, the return to capital will also have to fall somewhat. Now, will it fall enough to, you know, to guarantee that the concentration of wealth stabilizes exactly at the right level? You know, I'm not so sure. You know, I think we need to have a plan B, you know, in case the market forces themselves are not able to regulate inequality and stabilize inequality at the proper level. We need a plan B, which is we need democracy. We need strong democratic institutions. We need strong transparency about income and wealth dynamics so that we can adapt our social and fiscal institution to whatever is needed to put these strong market forces into the common interest. But we cannot just assume that, you know, and, you know, then if it happens to be the case, you know, that's why I want so much transparency in income and wealth and more transparency about income tax statistics in India, for instance. And, you know, I think that's important because then this allows us to have a public conversation and to adapt our institution to whatever is needed. And now, if there's no need for strong progressive taxation of income and wealth, you know, I'd be very happy to say, well, great, you know, we don't need it. But we should not just assume that we won't need it, otherwise we'll not be able to react.
So it's important not to be fatalistic. Arvind, let me turn to you on sort of engaging this thesis in two ways. One, kind of from the point of view of sort of, you might say, you know, are the mics working? So, Arvind, I want to engage with this thesis from two sort of different perspectives.
Hello?
Mike?
Hello? This one seems to be, sorry.
Or can you just give him a mic, maybe?
Hello? Hello?
Good.
So, Arvind, if you can engage with this thesis from two different perspectives. One, as it were, from the, you know, the difference between kind of the inter-country inequality and intra-country inequality. And relatedly, how do you, in a sense, position India's concerns with inequality in relation to this thesis?
Right. Thanks. First of all, you know, what an accent. I wish we could have that accent, you know. But anyway, and it is true, as Sebastian said, that I actually went back and read Balzac after the book, and if nothing else, I'm grateful to Thomas for having done that. But let me, you know, we're going to be a little bit provocative here, right? I mean, so let me say why I think it's a spectacular book, no question. But I find it mildly irritating in two ways, Thomas. First is the international dimension. You know, I think of the last 25, 30 years as from the point of view of we in the tropics or the south. It's kind of the golden age for all of us, because never before in history have so many countries, poor countries, caught up with the rich at such a fast pace. I call this convergence with a vengeance. You know, if you go back to, you know, the Industrial Revolution, it was divergence big time. The rich countries pulled away, but now the poorer countries are catching up. And, you know, so if you look at income distribution and stack up, you know, the world's 9 billion people, it is now more and more true that the poorer people are catching up with the average guy in the rich world. So we see this. So in that sense, I find the book irritating in terms of tone, that if you look at it from, you know, the point of view of what's happening in the US and England and Western Europe, I think Thomas's concerns are absolutely right. But if you shift the perspective to developing countries, I think the dynamism that we've seen in the last 30 years, first Japan, East Asia, China, India, Chile, you know, it's really a different world. So in terms of tone, I remain a kind of optimist rather than the slightly darker, you know, overtones that follow from Thomas's book. So I think that's, I think you need to keep this in mind. This is the golden age for, you know, us in the developing world. Never happened before. Second, mildly irritating point is that, you know, even what Thomas said just now, look, Thomas is concerned about a world where the rate of growth is less than, you know, the return to capital. I think we in India, or to put it differently, Thomas's concerns are about, you know, what happens in the context of, you know, when dynamism slows down, what happens? And of course, there are all these issues about, you know, income inequality at the very top in the Anglo-Saxon world. I think in India, I think the concerns are very different. You know, we have this dynamism, and so we want to see how do we use this dynamism where, in fact, G is vastly greater than R, and it's going to be so for about 30, 40 years, hopefully. How do we manage your concern about inequality during that process? And then, if you immediately, because there's no question, I mean, Thomas may deny it, there's no question that Thomas's book gives weight to what I would call the redistribution agenda over the growth agenda. And I'm not sure I'm willing to buy into that at this point of time. I mean, I know they're not necessarily contradictory. I know that investment in human capital, you know, is also good from a longer point of view. But equally, I could make the argument that, you know, investment in public investment, you know, the whole process of building markets, building institutions are maybe more important for your very concern about increasing, decreasing poverty and increasing inequality. Last point, and that the last point I would make is that on top of that, in India, when we think about the whole redistribution inequality concern, we have to think about many, many more axes than just income distribution. You know, there's spatial inequality, there's occupational inequality, caste, and all of that, and we'll come to that later.
You know, you have to just stipulate that Arvind's favorite thing in the whole world is to be irritated. So he's actually complimented you.
So let me make Thomas's job easier for himself before I turn it over to him. And this is also a way of both pushing Arvind's a kind of counter irritation, and to bring Thomas in on a specific point. So Arvind, look, as one understands sort of Thomas's point, right? First of all, and I think you will also agree, that one of the reasons growth has slowed down in India is because of inequality, right? Which is that you can have a pattern of growth that produces a form of inequality. That inequality then distorts the structure and nature of your democracy and democratic accountability and actually slows down growth. So I'm not sure it's as simple as a kind of growth versus inequality story. But the second and more technical point, and I want Thomas to comment on this, particularly for the young people here. So one of the great drivers of equality that Thomas writes about in Capital is, of course, the diffusion of, as it were, skills and education. That's supposed to be the great driver. India has not invested enough in it, and one of the striking points he makes, which I hope the chief economic advisor will respond to at some point, is that countries where health and education are privatized their GDP tends to get inflated. A very, very powerful point, right? But the warning in this is that the diffusion of education and skills may not be by itself enough to counteract the mechanisms that produce inequality. So Thomas, can you sort of reflect on that and perhaps use that as an occasion to,
Sure.
engage
Well,
with our
thanks for suggesting an answer. Let me, I'm really sorry, Arvind, that you are a bit irritated. So let me say a couple of things. First of all, let me apologize that India, China, Africa is not sufficiently present in my book, and I take this as a really good point. I think this book is too much centered on the historical experience of the West, broadly speaking. Now, let me say that this is not entirely my fault. This is because of a problem with access to data. And, I have spent a lot of time working with the historical data for India. 15 years ago already, I was working with Abhijit Banerjee, who was born in Calcutta, and we've been working with the historical data on India. Now, what happened, and this is a point where I am a bit irritated with the Indian government, is that the data disappeared.
Okay.
So let me please finish on this. So, India is a country with an income tax, but with no income tax statistics. And so Arvind told me that this is going to change, and this is good news. But let me say that for the past 15 years, I have heard many times people told me that this is going to change. So if this changes for good, this is really good news. But what's unique about India's experience with income tax transparency is that, there are other countries in the world like China who don't publish income tax statistics. The difference with India is that India used to publish income tax statistics, and then in 2000, all India income tax statistic publications were just interrupted. And for the past 15 years, it's just impossible to know year after year the number of taxpayers, the total amounts of their income, how much wage income, non-wage income by income bracket. You want to know how many people had income between 10 million rupees, 20 million rupees, what was the total amount of their income last year, wage income, non-wage income. You don't want to know their name. I'm just asking for purely anonymous information. But even this anonymous information
I would love to know
is
the
not,
names.
and, let me conclude on that. This is a country where a Right to Information Act was adopted 10 years ago. But at the same time, during the past 15 years, income tax statistics have entirely disappeared. So, I'm asking, why is it that, the media, the universities, the government have let that happen? So I think, inequality is a problem in developed countries, but it's even more of a problem in developing countries like India. And to conclude on what you mentioned, I think the view that we should not care too much about inequality, that we should care about growth, I think is really deeply wrong and mistaken. I think it's possible in a country like India at the same time to reduce inequality and to have more growth. And I think, right now, the kind of education and health services that the bottom half of this country or the bottom two-thirds of this country has access to is deeply insufficient if India wants to continue with growth and wants to become a developed country. So I think it's very important to increase the tax to GDP ratio gradually in this country if this country wants to be able to invest in growth. So I don't think there's a contradiction between reducing inequality and improving growth. With this level of inequality, it's like in Brazil, when you have such a high level of inequality, in Brazil, 60-65% of national income going to the top 10%. The idea that we should not care about inequality, we should only care about growth, I think is deeply wrong. India, we don't know exactly whether it's more unequal or less unequal to Brazil, because it's, so I don't know if India is the most unequal country in the world, but it's certainly not the most transparent.
Sebastian, come in and then I'll go.
This is great.
You should run for elected office, Thomas.
In India.
Yeah. There are not that many economic panels where people are clapping and getting, so that's great. It seems to me that fighting inequality, no matter what stage of development you're at, is good in itself. and also that inequality can be inimical to growth. You can have people whose human potential is underdeveloped because they haven't had schooling or they haven't had decent healthcare, and of course that means their economic potential is limited, and I think we would all agree with that. That's not really in contention. But there are ways, nonetheless, when you think about your growth strategy and how to improve development, there are ways you can do it which are sort of both good for equity and good for growth, and there are other ways where I think you mess up. So let's take an example which is maybe a little bit far from India, but comes back to the developed world. One of the points that I think Thomas makes is that the returns on capital for the rich tend to be rather good because they have more access to different investment opportunities, and that's something I happen to know about since I read a history of hedge funds. And it's true that hedge funds, they kind of, they exemplify this debate. You have these super rich people who make in crazy amounts of money. I call my book More Money Than God because Jupiter was the nickname of JP Morgan, who died with a fortune of $1.4 billion in 2010 dollars. So if you look at hedge fund managers these days, they could make $1.4 billion in a couple of years. So I thought more money than Jupiter meant more money than God. That's good enough for a book title. But the point here is, okay, so you've got this thing which drives some of the inequality. What do? And you could either close down their trading, which I think would make markets less efficient and for various reasons the financial system less stable, because if you don't like too big to fail banks, then small enough to fail hedge funds are better. So I don't think you should close these guys down, but what you should do is tax them. You should tax their profits, and that's a far more efficient way of addressing the inequality without screwing up the financial sector and so on. So I think you can have it both ways if you choose clever policies that don't mess up incentives too much, but do redistribute money.
Yeah. Let me, first of all, Thomas, I hope if we're back together next year at the Jaipur Literary Festival, you will have your income tax data. I will do my utmost to get that happen. And then you will then have to revise your view and come back and say India is actually quite a transparent country. Yeah? That's point. Point two, I think Thomas is being a little bit like an Indian journalist, which is being a bit selective. Nobody says that you should only prioritize growth over inequality and things. Thomas, I'm sure you will agree with me that the relationship between growth and inequality is complicated, but it's two-way. I mean, no doubt that inequality has an impact on growth, but equally, unobjectionably, more rapid growth does lead to declines in inequality. Just to give you one example, the fastest rate of reduction in poverty in India happened during the period when our growth was going gangbusters. And so I think, so it's not and I'd be the last person to say it's an either or choice. But I think that, in the business of policy making and politics, sometimes you have to, your political capital is limited, then you have to make these fine choices at the margin, the kinds of things that Sebastian was saying versus the kinds of things that you and Pratap are saying. But I think one thing I will, in the next economic survey that we're writing, actually we're going a lot into this whole question of, taxation, public expenditure, so on. But let me just say some preliminary findings. I think that India's taxation and spending on broad, for its level of development are not out of line, but if you control for democracy, I think we are a bit out of line. So amongst democratic countries, we tend to, undertax and maybe underspend, not on a broader cross-section of countries. That's a very interesting finding. But I think where you're absolutely right, is to me, and this is something that we'll talk about, just the number of taxpayers in India is abnormally low. So I have this statistic where, if you look at the ratio of taxpayers to voters, and you think that over time, taxation is kind of the glue between, the people who rule and the people who are ruled, that two-way civic relationship that comes with having more people paying taxes because it builds accountability and so on. I think there we are unusually low, and I think this government is very committed to actually increasing that tax base and then getting the resources and then devoting that to. But I think for me the key where perhaps we kind of falls short on some of the things that you talk about is, we need many, many more people engaged with the government via taxes, which I think is this. And I think if that happens, some of the concerns that even Pratap was talking about, how much spending we do on services. I mean, I agree, Pratap, that, the privatization of health and education is something that we need to address very seriously. But that's what I feel at this stage.
Okay, if we can just shift focus slightly, I mean, there's so many things to talk about and maybe a little bit kind of future related. So it was one of the most interesting chapters in the book is really about this kind of the relationship between the elasticity of capital and employment. And again, there are lots of young people here. I think if you ask the question, what is the single most important worry on their minds, it is jobs, 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 right? And this is true globally, right? And there are sort of two kind of different views on this. One is there's a kind of technological fatalism that we are at a moment where the employment elasticity of capital is going to fall with huge repercussions for inequality and employment globally. I mean, not just in developed countries, but actually in countries like India. There's another view in the sense which says that, look, a lot of the inequality is really driven by, and you also argue for that, really particular institutional choices that we have made in terms of letting fund managers set their own wages, those kinds of things. Where do you come down, or if you were to take a kind of guess, on this sort of employment elasticity of capital story for a country like India, which missed the bus on the manufacturing revolution? What advice would you give on how to think of the relationship between capital and job creation and employment?
Well, let me say, generally speaking, that I am much more optimistic than what some people seem to believe. And I am always a bit sad when people have a pessimistic or sometimes even apocalyptic reading of my book, because this is not at all my state of mind. And in particular, I don't particularly fear technological evolution in themselves. I think in the end, institutions and policy choices are really what have created excessive inequality in some countries rather than in others. So I think it all depends. If you think of the huge explosion of very top managerial compensations that we've seen in a number of countries, I think this has really little to do with technology or skill bias, technical change. It's not that the marginal productivity of top managers has gone from $1 million to $10 million per year suddenly in the US. I don't buy that. I think it has more to do with the institutions, the failure of the corporate governance systems, the ability sometimes of top managers to put the right people in the right compensation committee. And in the end, the technological change, I think, is full of promise, assuming we have the proper educational, social system, labor market system, so that more and more people can access the high-paying jobs that can come with the technological change. So to me, the proper investment in skills is really, together with the set of other, corporate governance, fiscal institutions that can prevent some people from, sort of basically extracting more than they should, is the way to cope with it. Now, in the very long run, there's also a possibility, but we're really not there yet, that the robotization, the sort of capital intensity of production gets so far that indeed the overall share going to capital increases and the labor share declines. Now, we're really not there yet. I think most of the increase in the capital shares that we've seen in recent decades has more to do with very traditional capital-intensive sector like energy, real estate, than with robots. Now, 30 years from now, maybe it will be different. Then, part of the solution will be to try to redirect technical change and the tax system taxing more capital and less labor is one of the obvious evolution to try to counteract this. But again, we are not there yet, and I am not at all, sort of technological pessimist.
Okay, I just want to raise one question and want all three of you to kind of comment, because you've all worked on it, which is this big question of the role of foreign capital in development. And the role of foreign capital, there's a technical aspect to it in terms of sort of, capital market controls and so forth. But there's also the policy aspect, which is the general assumption is the dependence on foreign capital reduces the domestic democratic space to take the kinds of policy measures, some of the policy measures that you are in a sense recommending. So if we could just have a quick reflection from all of you on how you think of the role of foreign capital at this particular historical juncture with a potential financial crisis looming around the corner with, as it were, to use an atrocious one, a kind of a China in the bull shop, as it were, looming around the corner. And what advice you would have for a country like India trying to position itself at the crossroads of integration into the global economy and global financial capital?
I think, of course, foreign investment, foreign capital can be very useful, but we have to be careful not to be too much dependent on that, and not to have too much. I think the level of opacity in cross-border financial flows and cross-border financial assets has reached a level which makes all of us in danger, in rich countries, but also, in emerging countries where, the rise of tax havens, the rise of dark finance, and capital flight, and a big part of the elite, not only in the West but in India today, and maybe even more so in India or China, are putting their money abroad, sometimes in a very opaque manner to avoid taxation. And I think we all have a lot to lose from that, and India in particular would have a lot to win from trying to regulate and bring more automatic transmission of information about these flows. If we take an even longer run historical perspective, what I try to stress in my book is that when you have massive foreign capital ownership, this can come with a lot of political tension and difficulties in the end. It's always difficult to pay rent to the owner of your apartment, to pay rent to the owner of capital. But when it's a country paying rent to another country and paying huge capital income payment to another country, we've seen that in history under, colonial empires, where in effect Britain and France, were getting huge capital income payment from countries like India or from Africa or from other parts of the world. And this, so in the economic textbook model, this is supposed to be nice and efficient and harmonious and mutually beneficial. But in practice, this came with political domination. Otherwise these assets would have been expropriated a long time ago. So we have to remember, with the modern economy and financial system, this could go even further in the future that we've seen in the past, in the sense you can have massive position of one country over the other. And I think inequality is already very difficult to regulate peacefully within a given political community and within a given political democratic community. We have to agree on the acceptable level of inequality and proper redistribution, and we see that many times extreme inequality even within a given political community leads to violence, leads to nationalism, leads to, and we see that, certainly, in my country, in France, with the rise of the extreme right, but we see that in India, and we've seen that very recently. So extreme inequality can already lead to violence within a given political community. Now, when inequality is external to this political community, in the sense that a big part of the owners do not even belong to this political community, so you cannot even make them pay tax, you cannot have common regulation, common legal system, then it's even more difficult to have peaceful regulation. And to me, this is the biggest danger of inequality, that this can lead to nationalism, violence, if we don't take care of it in a more peaceful and democratic manner.
Okay, so
foreign capital, and then Sebastian on this foreign capital.
Yeah, I think that I would love to hear what Sebastian has to say as well, because I think there's also the question of what do we think about the rise of finance per se, not just international capital, which is interesting. Let me just focus on the international dimension. I think I would say two or three things. First, I think we need to distinguish between types of foreign capital. I think at this stage in India, foreign direct investment, the stuff that actually brings in plant, machinery, investment, technology, I think is terribly important. I think it's a way of making the Indian economy much more competitive. I think we should be clear about. But it's these other forms of finance, the hot stuff, the money that comes in and goes, debt. I think that we have to be very, very cautious about in embracing for a number of reasons. I think first, there is the political point that all of you have raised that, what does it do? But also, I think from a more economic point of view, that, do we have the capacity, one, to cope with, money coming in and out so rapidly? And I think it's a condition of all developing countries that we don't have the best way of coping with this, and therefore we should be much more cautious about embracing that. I mean, the other thing which is a point that I keep saying often in India, but I think with very little success, is that, I think that the more foreign capital that comes in, especially of the hot variety, the more we are likely to make our economy uncompetitive. The money comes in, the exchange rate becomes very strong, and our exports suffer as a result. So I think that, and to me, what is really very, in some ways, a bit, striking, is that unlike many developing countries in the world about 10, 15 years ago that were already very open to foreign capital, we have the luxury of being able to choose how much more open we can become. Because remember, once you're open to go back, it becomes very difficult. But we have that choice, and I think we should be very cautious about embracing certain forms of capital.
So let me copy Arvind and venture some just mild irritation of the following sort. So Thomas' contribution to these debates is partly to say, hey, we don't have to take these trends for granted. Inequality may rise because of forces to do with the ratio of capital to income. And we don't have to sit here like lemons and just do nothing. We can raise taxes. We can think about why chief executives are paid too much. And we can do political change that fixes this. And in the same way, I would urge you to think that just because it's true that national opinion may resent payment of dividends and interest to foreign owners, we shouldn't just sit there and accept that. We as writers should expend our energy in trying to explain that there is a role for foreign capital to cross borders. Because why? Because there are some countries which have a lot of labor and not enough capital. And if you bring in more capital in a safe kind of way, as Arvind says, through foreign direct investment, not hot money that goes in and out, this means that there will be more plant and machinery, which will enable more workers to work in a productive environment, produce more, get paid more, and come out of poverty. So I think, there is a sort of very easy theoretical case for why cross-border capital flows are a good thing. And yes, there are political problems, but we should use our energy in trying to explain why those political problems need to be managed. We shouldn't just cave in.
So, it's tempting to kind of keep on exploiting the store of knowledge you have. So I'll just kind of, one last question before we open up, which is the other big mechanism through which elites have, in a sense, perpetuated, if you like, sort of the returns on capital, involves the role of government, which is public debt, which has been historically a very powerful mechanism which structures opportunities for lots of people and so forth. And as you know, right now there is a big debate globally about not just austerity in Europe, but in India there's a big debate about public debt and how seriously we should take the kinds of fiscal targets that the government has set. At this historical juncture, now every argument on public debt has to be a contextual argument, I think. Do you have a sort of quick take on how we should think about the question of public debt? What advice would you give Arvind?
Well, if you look at the Indian level of public debt from a European perspective or from an historical perspective, of course, this is clearly a much smaller. Now, I'm not saying this is a reason necessarily to increase it without limit, but it's look, I definitely prefer taxation to public debt and deficit. I think public spending need to be financed. So I think if India is to spend 20% of GDP rather than 10% of GDP on its education, health, public infrastructure, then it needs to raise 20% in tax rather than 10% in tax. In the long run, there's no doubt about it. Now, in the transition, it makes sometimes sense to finance some of the spending through a bit more debt, but in the end, you have to have the tax levels that go with the spending level you want to pay for. Now, sometimes in some countries, you inherit from the past from a very large level of public debt, and here we should be very clear that, when you have very low inflation, getting rid of public debt, a huge public debt, takes a lot of time and will never work. So, if we look at Europe right now, or Japan, or to some extent the US, I think it will make sense to have a little bit more inflation and to have some debt restructuring in some cases, which we have seen. In the good news is that when you look at history, the reason I think it's very important to take historical perspective on this is that we've already seen that kind of crisis in the past, and the good news from history is that there are always alternatives. There are always alternative ways to deal with a problem. So, you see example in the past where public debt was 200% of GDP in Germany, in France, so much bigger economies than Greece today. And we've always found ways to get around it. And in particular, after World War II, a choice was made in the 1950s to have a massive debt restructuring for Germany and France, which never repaid their public debt after World War II. This was a good choice. This is what allowed these countries, to invest in post-war growth and to invest in the new generation. This was a way to tell the new generation, well, look, whatever your parents did and messed up, and indeed their parents messed up a lot, but the message was, let's now invest in the future, invest in growth. And it's a bit ironical that today, these same countries, Germany and France, are telling Greece and Portugal and Italy, oh, you have to pay until the last euro. And there's a level of historical amnesia that we see sometimes in this kind of policy debate, which I think is problematic. So, looking at history doesn't give one solution, but that's, at least it shows that there are alternatives.
Very quickly.
No, I have a question for Thomas, if I may.
Very quickly.
Thomas, one dimension of inequality that's perhaps very important in India, I'd love your views on, because you don't cover it, is, what our friend Devesh Kapoor talks about, the cognitive inequality and the inequality of dignity. In India, we have this phenomenon of, caste and all this, and in fact, we've made great progress on that. I just wanted to, for example, in Arvind Adiga's book, The White Tiger, the last sentence is about the person saying he's very happy to have killed the person because it felt so good not to be a servant. So how does kind of inequality of dignity, cognitive inequality, I would love to hear your views on that.
Well, look, I think India has had to face sort of the consequences of extreme inequality of status coming from past discrimination, and has had to invent a sort of unique system of reservations to try to counter this legacy. I think, it would be too easy for the rest of the world to say, well, this is a purely Indian problem. I think the issue of equal opportunity is a problem everywhere. Maybe the reservation system in the long run need to become gradually based more on parental income or parental assets than the caste in itself, but this, this has to be gradual. And in any case, I think the rest of the world, has a lot to learn from looking at the way, India, with all its limitation, has tried to face this problem of extreme inequality of status and dignity, which, in supposedly developed countries, we tend to pretend that we have a world of equal opportunity where the poor can access higher education as well as the rich. But of course, there is a lot of hypocrisy there. And I think we should look at this experience and together think of better ways to promote effective equal opportunity.
So we'll just take one or two quick questions from the floor. If you can be very pointed. Sorry, we're running out of time. Yes, ma'am.
On? Okay. So one of the things I found underlying this debate is that producing more is important. I think Sebastian and Arvind spoke more about that. But doesn't that also create relentless consumption? And creating relentless consumption also causes a whole lot of economic problems of its own. So what do you say about
maybe
that?
we'll just collect a couple so you can answer them quickly. Yes, sir.
I fully agree that taxation has to be widespread, and India doesn't have that right now. I think one way would be to reduce taxes and increase the consumption tax, especially on cars and everything else, so high that the rich can pay for the development that needs to take place.
Okay, Veena, just right there.
Yeah, thanks, I'll be quick. You know, when Marx wrote Capital, he glossed over gender inequality, but that was the 19th century. How do you justify not talking about gender inequality in a book written in the 21st century? There is, and